Wind always whistles differently in Texas, especially when you're standing on its border and you know that once you take that step, you'll never be the same again. On days like that, the air becomes thicker, as if filled with invisible questions and ghostly promises. It was a day like that when Jesse Carter and Sam Wilder left their hometown, where they knew every stone, every path, every face. Jesse looked at the house that had always been both his refuge and his prison. A house built of sturdy wood, with peeling white paint and shutters that his father had promised to fix but never got around to. A house where every board was familiar to the point of splinters. A house where childhood memories remained behind the creaky door, warm and bitter, mixed into a single sticky cocktail that made his chest ache. Sam looked different next to him. He was born for moments like this, for roads stretching beyond the horizon, for the unknown that always made his eyes burn. He stood straight, his chin held high, as if challenging his entire former life, which he was easily turning his back on. But Jesse saw more. Behind that defiant gaze was a shadow, a barely perceptible sadness, as if Sam, challenging the world, was also fighting something inside himself. They saddled their horses, their saddlebags modestly filled with clothes, a little food, a couple of worn books, and a diary that Jesse carefully hid at the bottom. They weren't looking for gold or revenge for past wrongs. Their journey was one of discovery, a thirst to learn something new about themselves and the world, to feel alive where there had once been only monotony and predictability. There were few people seeing them off. Jesse's parents, holding back tears, waved goodbye, while Sam's mother didn't even come out onto the porch, watching from behind the curtains with pain and disapproval. They knew that the two young men were leaving the comfort and security of home for something greater, but they feared that this greater thing would prove to be unforgiving and unpredictable. As the houses began to disappear behind the hills and the town was reduced to a dot on the horizon, Jesse felt a strange sense of relief and sadness at the same time. He glanced at his friend. Sam was smiling, looking ahead to where the endless prairies stretched out, where the earth merged with the sky in a vague promise of freedom. At that moment, Jesse realized that their journey had already begun. There was no turning back. Adventures, trials, and discoveries awaited them ahead, but for now they were just two silhouettes against the sunset, disappearing into the dust of the roads leading to the unknown. By the second week of the journey, the road had ceased to be romantic. The dust, which at first seemed light, almost poetic, now clogged our ears, got under our fingernails, and stung our eyes. The horses walked slowly, as if they could sense that the ground beneath them was becoming drier, the air heavier, and that ahead lay only heat and plains. It was a dusty trail to Arizona, winding westward, looping around sparse trees, across sun-scorched hills and dry creeks. They rode in silence, their words stuck in their throats from the dust and thirst. The sun beat down mercilessly, and each day became like the last, gray, hot, and dull. On the third night of their journey, they found shelter in an old abandoned stagecoach station. The stonework was solid, but the roof had long since collapsed, and the sky looked in, a silent witness to the past. Here they built a fire, feeling a little less vulnerable for the first time in a long time. Late in the evening, when the flames were crackling evenly, a stranger emerged from the darkness. Gray-haired, wearing a worn cloak and carrying a copper mug, he approached silently, nodded, and sat down by the fire, as if he had been expected. Jesse was wary, but Sam glanced at him, signaling to leave the old man alone and let him catch his breath. The old man turned out to be a vagabond who had come from the south. He spoke little, but each word carried more weight than many speeches. He told them a story about how he had once lost his entire family and had been walking ever since, not in search of anything, just so he wouldn't have to stand still. "In motion is truth," he said, and it stuck in Jesse's mind. In the morning, the stranger disappeared as if he had never been there, but his words remained like a thorn in his memory. The road ahead became different, the land became wider, the silence louder, and each day harder. They arrived in Arizona exhausted. The landscape had changed slightly. Now it was an almost dead desert, with cacti, rattlesnakes, and heat that made the rocks as hot as frying pans. They lost track of the days. They had to trade water with passing trucks, sometimes stealing it. Several times they had to sleep in the saddle, afraid that someone might attack them at night, whether it was animals or one of the local hunters looking for easy prey. Closer to the south, in a small village, they were attacked by 3 local men who tried to rob them. It all happened quickly. One grabbed Sam by the shoulder, and the second yanked his saddlebag. But Sam didn't flinch. He punched the first man hard in the jaw, and he flew backward, knocking the second man down. The third lunged at Jesse, who, without thinking, kicked him, then punched him, breaking into a fierce, brutal fight. No one fired a shot. They had weapons, but they weren't used to killing yet. They fought quickly and fiercely, without words, their jaws clenched and pulsing with rage. The bandits weren't ready for a fight. One was left lying in the dust, another crawled away with a broken nose, and the third disappeared around the corner of the house. Jesse and Sam pushed the troughs aside, saddled their horses, and rode off without looking back. When the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon and the sky turned red, they settled down for the night right on the open plain. No fire, no words. They just lay there and looked up at the sky. There, among the stars, Jesse realized that the road was beginning to take its toll. It tests not the strength of your hands, but the strength of your spirit. And only those who do not give up at night will be able to meet the morning as a different person. The road into New Mexico was not just difficult. It seemed to breathe heat and indifference. There were no tracks, no directions. Only sand, stone, and the sky stretched out overhead like a faded veil. The space grew wider, quieter, more merciless. The horses walked slowly, their heads bowed, leaving faint prints in the sand with each step, which were immediately blown away by the wind. All living things froze during the day and woke up at night when the heat subsided, and the desert began to whisper something ancient. On the third night, they were caught in a sandstorm. It came, as always, suddenly, with a roar, a howl, and a yellow darkness that engulfed everything in a matter of minutes. The horses went wild. One bolted and disappeared in a cloud of dust. The other almost carried Jesse away, but he managed to hold on to the reins. Sam tried to calm the animal, but the wind knocked him off his feet. They shouted at each other, drowning out the roar. Sam yelled at Jesse to cover his face. Jesse yelled at Sam to let go of the reins. The storm spared neither sound nor breath. Everything around them roared, spun, and whipped sand against their skin. They reached a large boulder and pressed themselves against the ground, covering their faces with bandanas. Their hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger and helplessness. Nothing was going according to plan. Jesse cursed in despair, throwing his head back and shouting, "Why the hell did we come to this desert?" Sam didn't answer, clenching his fists so hard that his knuckles turned white. He looked away, toward where the horse had disappeared. When the storm subsided An eerie silence fell. The morning was gray, as if the world had burned out overnight. They found the horse, exhausted, a few miles from their boulder. It was a miracle, or just a fluke, which were becoming increasingly rare in these parts. They didn't smile. They just saddled up and continued on their way. None of them said lucky. None of them patted the other on the shoulder. They just kept moving. That day, Jesse hardly looked around. His eyes were focused inward. He felt the road turning him inside out, washing away everything superfluous. His thoughts became simpler, his senses sharper. A sip of water, the shadow of a rock, the clatter of hooves. Everything else receded, losing its meaning, and all his everyday problems now seemed so trivial. Sam didn't lose his confidence, but something in him was changing. He was quieter than usual. No teasing, no stories about those he knew and left behind. He just walked alongside, as if he were Jesse's shadow, or vice versa. Towards evening, they found a rock with a hollow in it, almost a cave. They built a fire and spread out their sleeping bags. The desert at sunset was painfully beautiful, the pink sky, the long shadows, and the silence in which every sound seemed to last forever. They sat in silence until the sun disappeared. Then Sam said, "You know, sometimes I feel like we're not going somewhere, but away from something." Jesse didn't answer. He knew it was true. That night he dreamed of his home, but it wasn't him standing in the doorway. It was someone else. Jesse woke up before dawn, sat down by the fire, and watched the embers die for a long time. The desert taught them to shout at the top of their lungs. It taught them to argue with the wind, and it reminded them that the road is not a line on a map. It's what happens to you when you can lose everything except yourself. Santa Fe greeted them as any living city of that time would, dusty, noisy, and deceptively warm. After weeks spent among rocks and sand, this city seemed like a mirage that had suddenly become real. The streets breathed the smell of roasted meat, cheap tobacco, manure, and sweat. Everywhere there were horses, shouts, children's laughter, and the clatter of wheels. Life was boiling like soup in an old cauldron. Sam immediately perked up. His gait became springy again, his eyes playful. He immediately started chatting with street vendors, eyeing leather gloves, and even tried to gamble a couple of coins while Jesse tied up the horses. The city seemed to have infused him with new blood. For Jesse it was more complicated. Everything annoyed him. The hustle and bustle, the crowds, the noise, the rush. After the desert, it all seemed unnecessary, even hostile. He didn't know what to expect from himself in this place, where everyone laughed louder than they should, and every glance could be a trap. But it was here that he first felt something new growing deep inside him, something that had nothing to do with his home, his past, or his habits. Here, everything reminded him that you are nobody until you become somebody. They found a cheap room on the second floor above a tavern. The room was cramped, with beds that looked more like carts, and a single window overlooking a noisy alley. But after nights spent under the open sky, even this seemed luxurious. Every evening they went out onto the streets. Sam led the way, Jesse followed. Sam argued in saloons, flirted with women, drank, laughed, lived. Jesse didn't interfere. He was there, but it was as if he were behind glass. Sometimes he smiled, nodded, bought himself tea instead of bourbon, didn't play poker, but watched Sam play. He wasn't part of that life, but he respected his friend's ability to blend into it. And then one day, on the eve of his departure, when the evening was particularly warm, they were walking through the streets again, and then Jesse saw her. A girl in a blue dress was sitting on the porch, laughing with someone. The light fell on her shoulders, making her hair almost silver. He didn't approach her. He just stood in the shadows, listening to her laughter, and suddenly felt so light that it scared him. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay there staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since he had set out on his journey, he wondered, maybe I should stay. Maybe this road isn't leading forward, but inward? The next morning, Sam sat by the window, chewing an apple, glancing at his friend. Then he said unexpectedly, "The city is a trap, Jess. It's warm until you slip up, and then it swallows you." Jess didn't answer, but that day he didn't look back at the alley where she had been standing yesterday. The next morning they set off west again, away from the lights that warm but don't wait. They entered the mountains with the first cold snap. The ground beneath their feet changed. The rocks became rougher, the trails narrower, and the air heavier. The landscape around them changed from endless expanses to winding gorges and forests whose crowns clung to the sky with claws of branches. Everything became denser, as if nature itself was squeezing them, testing whether they could withstand it. It rained for 3 days straight. Drops pounded on their hats, saddles, and faces. Their clothes became sticky, wet, and no longer warm. They moved slowly, step by step, as if climbing not up a ridge, but into the very essence of their doubts. The path became quieter and quieter, harder and harder. At altitude, the wind cut into their faces like a knife, and every breath seemed to pierce them from within. Jesse began to tire earlier than the others. His body was still holding up, but his thoughts were racing. He was exhausted not so much from the road as from the constant tension, from the fact that anything could be waiting around every bend in the trail. He felt that Sam was looking at him more often than before, without words, without reproach, just with understanding. On the third day in the mountains, by a frozen stream, they stopped to set up camp. Night crept up quickly, and the sky dropped low, as if it wanted to crush them with its weight. The wood was damp, the fire barely burned, and the campfire gave off little heat. Sam covered the horses and checked the saddles, while Jesse sat staring into the flames. The wind blew them out again and again. They were silent, but there was tension in the silence, like before a storm. When a faint fire finally lit up, Sam sat down nearby. The wind howled somewhere in the rocks, and it seemed like it wasn't the wind, but the voices of those who had once walked here and never made it. The mountains held memories. Every bend hinted at something. Every rock showed traces of someone's fall. Jesse could feel it in his skin. Neither of them slept that night. Sam tossed and turned, got up, went to check on the horses. Jesse lay staring at the starless sky. He thought about home, about his mother, about how many more nights he could spend like this without breaking down. His breath hung in the darkness as if his soul was trying to escape. In the morning, they continued on their way. The mountains wouldn't let them go. One turn followed another, and each time they had to make a choice. Up or down, right or left, go on or turn back. But there was no turning back. Later, in one of the gorges, Jesse's horse slipped and nearly fell with him. He fell, scraping his hands, tearing his jacket, fear pounding in his chest. Sam helped him up. They stood among the rocks, breathing heavily. Jesse felt his knees shaking, and suddenly he realized the road could break them not with a blow, but with its constant weight. Sam said nothing. He just nodded, and they moved on. This part of the journey left no happy memories, only the feeling that a part of them had been left behind in the mountains, the part that was weakening, the part that was afraid, the part that was preventing them from moving forward. When they finally saw the valley hidden between the peaks, the sun broke through the clouds, but didn't shine. It simply reminded them that life goes on, even after you leave a part of yourself in the mountains. They crossed the state line in early summer. California did not greet them with gold, as in the stories, but with scorched grass, dusty roads, and thick air that smelled of salt, wine, and sun. The earth became softer, the hills lower, the people louder. Everything around them seemed to say, "You can live here." Somewhere between small villages and vineyards, they saw the ocean for the first time in a long time. It appeared suddenly after another descent, without fanfare, without sound, just a faint glimmer on the horizon. And everything inside them tightened. It was the edge. And at the same time, it was not the end. Sam was as happy as a child. He took off his hat, spread his arms to the wind, and said that now he understood why everyone here lost their minds. Jesse looked at him and smiled. He even joked that Sam finally looked like he had found something important besides himself. Sam snorted, threw dust at him, and they both laughed. The laughter was awkward, but lively, the kind that hadn't been heard between them in a long time. They stopped in San Francisco. The city was a world apart from everything they had known before. Everything was different here. Sea urchins and maps of distant lands were sold on the streets. Portuguese, Chinese, and Mexicans drank in taverns, and lights flickered in the windows until dawn. Sam absorbed it all like a sponge. He took Jesse through the streets, went to the port, haggled with fishermen, learned to swear in other languages, and struck up conversations that were impossible to get out of. Jesse stayed close, but didn't lose himself. He didn't seek out parties or gamble, but listened, watched, and felt. In one shop he bought an old map, not because he believed it was accurate, but because he wanted to remember how far they had come. Sometimes in the evenings they would sit by the shore and watch the boats disappear into the sunset. Sam would tell stories he made up on the spot, as if everything he saw became his own past. Jesse listened. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he threw pebbles at him. Sometimes he reminded him about falling off a horse in the Rocky Mountains, and Sam pretended not to hear, but he smiled every time. One night, Sam said they could stay, build something, maybe a workshop or a boat station. Jesse knew it wasn't a real plan, just another mirage at the edge of the earth. But he didn't interrupt. He knew that thoughts like that needed to be spoken aloud, otherwise they would rot inside. In the morning, they decided to move on. No maps, no roads, just south, along the ocean. Jesse didn't ask why. Sam didn't explain. They just knew they had to go. And as the wind whipped their raincoats and the cries of seagulls drowned out their thoughts, they began to feel like themselves again. The people who had once left Texas, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, but knowing for sure that staying put wasn't for them. California was left behind like a strange dream, beautiful and warm, but not theirs. The South turned out to be tougher than they had expected. The road along the ocean was deceptively beautiful. The blue expanse, the endless horizon, the gentle breeze. But with each passing day, this corner of the world became more and more unreal. The trees thinned out, settlements disappeared. People became more withdrawn, conversations shorter, faces sunburnt. Sam was still joking, but more quietly. He kept staring at the horizon, as if looking for something no one else could see. Sometimes he would stop, stand there for a long time, biting his lip, and Jesse knew that something was stirring inside him that he couldn't put into words. When they set up camp, Sam would start pacing in circles as if there was no room inside him for this peace. He might throw his hat on the sand, sit down next to it, and talk about how strange it was that the world was so big, yet so small inside. Jesse listened, sometimes teasing him about some silly thing that had happened on the road. And then Sam would laugh, but less and less genuinely. They spent 2 days on one of the coastal cliffs. Neither of them said it was a stop. They just didn't leave. Where the land broke off into the sky and the waves below roared as if angry at the land itself, they sat side by side like two people who had nothing to prove to each other. On the first evening, Jesse took the diary he had brought with him from Texas out of his saddlebag and began to write. His fingers trembled. Each word seemed to tear away a piece of who he was. He didn't know what he was writing, memories, fears, gratitude, or just an attempt not to forget. Sam, meanwhile, threw stones into the abyss, laughing as they disappeared into the depths. Then he came over, looked over his shoulder, muttered something like, "Finally," and sat down next to him. No advice, no jokes, just being there. On the second day, the sky darkened. A cold wind blew in from the water. They wrapped themselves in their jackets and sat silently by the dying fire. Jesse asked Sam what he saw out there, beyond the water. Sam smiled and said that it was probably himself, if he were different. Then he added that maybe that was how it should be, to come to the edge and realize that you're going to keep going anyway. And at that moment, Jesse realized that the road would never end, not because it was impossible to reach the end, but because people are always searching for something. He looked at his friend, tired, alive, fragile in his freedom, and he understood that this was the meaning of it all. The next morning, they saddled their horses. No goodbyes, no words. They just turned away from the ocean and rode back, but not back. Forward, along a new circle of the road that never ends. The road back turned out to be no less long than the road to the ocean, but it was different. Not in terms of the landscape, but in terms of feeling. Everything they passed seemed familiar, but changed. The sun shone the same, the trees swayed in the same wind, but the world was no longer the same, because they were no longer the same. They moved slowly, almost aimlessly. Sometimes they strayed from the straight path, simply because they wanted to see what was behind the hill. They no longer drove themselves forward. They did not seek meaning. They just drove. There was no passion in this movement, only calmness. And in this calmness, there was strength. Along the way, they met other travelers, gray-haired men with eyes that seemed to see right through you, women with children pulling wagons, cowboys who had lost their former swagger. Some said hello, some nodded silently. Jesse began to pay closer attention to their faces. He peered as if looking for something they all had in common, perhaps something that connects everyone who has ever left home. One night they spent the night in the ruins of a farm whose walls were held together only by stubborn clay and old nails. Sam threw off his saddle, tossed it into a corner, and sat for a long time, staring at the charred beams. Then he said that someone must have dreamed of staying here, but all that was left was ashes. Jesse threw some wood on the fire and reminded him that they could have stayed too. Sam smiled, looked at him sideways. They didn't discuss whether they had done the right thing in moving on. The answer was in their silent agreement to light another fire, lie back to back once more, and expect nothing from the morning except the sun. A couple of days later, they stopped at a tavern at a fork in the road. There, sitting at a dusty table, was an old man with a book. He glanced at them and said that the road back is always harder than the road forward. Jesse asked why. The old man replied that hope lies ahead, but only memories lie behind. Sam didn't argue. He just bought some bread and a little salt, and they left without looking back. Somewhere in the backwoods they came across an abandoned train. Rusty and crooked, it stood like a monument to the fact that even steel is not eternal. Sam climbed onto the roof of a car, sat down, and dangled his legs. Jesse stayed below. Sam shouted something, waving his arms as if he were conducting his own orchestra of silence and wind. Jesse looked up and remembered him that way, alive, free, slightly lost, but still moving forward. When they saw the plains again, the familiar outlines of trees and rivers, they felt neither joy nor disappointment. It was like a breath of air, deep, calm, accepted. They had returned home. They had returned to themselves. And the road, strangely enough, continued. They returned to familiar lands without fanfare. The plains that once seemed endless now greeted them differently, not loudly or reservedly, but as if quietly nodding. You have arrived. The trees along the road were the same, the river flowed in the same channel, but there was a feeling in the air that they had been expected here. Or maybe it was just the emptiness that had grown accustomed to waiting for those who returned changed. They drove without haste. Sometimes Jesse said something about his childhood, about the old paths they used to run barefoot along. Sam nodded, remembering how he once fell out of a tree and laughed for a long time until Jesse cried with fear. They both laughed, though not as loudly as before. There was no melancholy in these memories, only warmth. But the town they entered was not the same as they remembered it. Something had changed. Or maybe they had changed. The people seemed different, not because they had become strangers, but because there was something in their eyes that they hadn't noticed before, a habit of anxiety. In the evening, as the sun was setting, they stopped at a tavern on the outskirts. There, among the locals, there was a palpable tension. Conversations died down when the door opened and hands slid closer to belts. At a distant table, someone whispered about rumors. Raiders had recently begun operating in the area, a young gang, greedy, loud, and thoughtless. Sam glanced at Jesse. It was clear. This road was not over yet. Late at night, when the town was asleep, they heard footsteps. Not angry, but confident. 3 men rode out into the street, masked and on fast horses. They spread out around the perimeter, heading for the barn and the store. Everything was planned out. Silent. Precise. Sam quietly moved toward the door, Jesse covering him from the side. Their fingers slid to their weapons, not out of panic, but out of clarity. They weren't looking for a fight. But if someone came to take what wasn't theirs, they had to be stopped. The first shot tore through the night like a knife through cloth. One of the raiders collapsed without realizing where the shot had come from. The second rushed to his horse. The third tried to hide behind the wagon, but Sam was already there. It all happened in a matter of seconds. No words, no screams. Only dust, flashes, and a cloud of smoke hanging in the air. When everything calmed down, there was silence, like after a thunderstorm. The locals slowly began to emerge from their houses and alleys. Some approached, some held their breath. One of the men bent over the body of the raider and recognized him as the man who had beaten his son on the road a month ago. Another woman sobbed, saying that these guys had kept half the county in fear. People recognized them, and they realized that the night was finally over. Someone slapped Sam on the shoulder. Another shook Jesse's hand. The next morning, the innkeeper set a table for them, not for money, but from the heart. Scrambled eggs, freshly baked bread, strong coffee, and simple human warmth. They spent another day in the town, sitting by the window, watching life come back to life for the first time in a long time. And only the next day, when the town had finally awakened, did they saddle their horses and set off, slowly, without haste, back to where it all began. And when the familiar hills became part of the landscape again, they realized home is not a place. It is a state of being. It is what is inside you when you have reached the final frontier and remain true to yourself. And with this thought, they finally slowed their pace, not because they were tired, but because there was nowhere left to rush to. And finally, they returned to where they had once left. Time seemed to flow differently here. Their traces had long since been erased from this land, but the air still seemed to remember. The place hadn't changed, only their shadows falling on their native soil had changed. The road to the old hut remained the same, familiar curves, the familiar smell of dry grass, the same creaking of the wind in the cracked shutters. But they themselves were different, older. New wrinkles had settled on their faces, and their eyes were filled with a distance that could not be measured in steps. They were the ones who had gone through the storm, through hell, through emptiness, through the challenges thrown at them by fate, through laughter and fear. And yet they had survived. The old hut stood as it had always stood, as if it had been waiting all this time. The boards were darkened, the paint was peeling, and it was silent inside. It did not demand attention. It simply was. Sam dismounted, walked past Jesse without saying a word, and sat down on the steps. He took off his hat, ran his hand over his forehead, and stared into the distance. Jesse placed the saddle against the wall, removed the reins, and leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. It was a brief pause from everything that had accumulated during their journey before entering the house. They spent 3 days there, no plans, no need to explain to each other why they stayed. In the morning, they made coffee, unpacked their saddlebags, and fixed small things. Sometimes they recalled the journey, in fragments, through jokes, through details. One talked about how Sam once fell asleep on his horse. Another recalled how Jesse stumbled while trying to swing his leg over. And then they laughed genuinely. On the second day, an old man from a nearby farm came to visit them. He brought his grandson with him. The boy ran around the yard, peered into the windows, examined the harness, and tried to tie a knot in an old rope. Sam lifted him onto a horse, holding him by the back. Jesse watched from the shadows, leaning on the railing, and at one point smiled without realizing it. With the child's laughter, everything else seemed quieter. It was as if that was why they had come back, to see someone else take their first steps in the saddle. On the third day, they gathered their belongings, without unnecessary conversation or lingering glances. All that passed between them had already left its mark, remembered without needing to be said, been remembered and needed no explanation. They saddled their horses calmly and confidently. The fire in the hearth died out on its own. No one bothered to touch it. They set off at dawn. The grass glistened with dew, the birds sang in the treetops, and the road stretched not forward, but simply onward. The air was fresh, and there was more completeness in that morning than in 100 words. Dust rose behind them. It settled on the fence and the grass. Ordinary dust. But it contained a part of everything they had gone through: fears, choices, loneliness, and time. This dust knew everything. It held the traces of those who had once set out on a path and could no longer turn back. They rode side by side. Ahead of them lay more than they could imagine. The world did not grow quieter. It called out to them. Every bend, every trail could be a new beginning. They did not look for reasons. They simply knew that movement gave meaning. As the old man by the campfire had once said, "Truth is in movement. Truth is in the journey." Now they were no longer fugitives or seekers. They had become part of the road itself, and they knew that if they ever stopped, it would not be for long. Because once you have tasted freedom, you can no longer live any other way. The dust will remain, but the road always goes on, and the traveler always needs it. Dear friends, what do you think of the story of Jesse and Sam, two friends who set out on a journey not for fame, but for something greater? They were looking for freedom, themselves, and that feeling that only comes from movement. No one knows what awaits them next. Maybe it's a place where they'll finally want to stay? Write in the comments how you see their future. Where do you think they're headed? Could you live like that, always on the road? Thank you for being with me.